underway with the African American Civil Rights Movement, and this movement was significant in American history, one of the most known movements. And essentially, I would like to talk about how this movement began. This movement began around after the time of World War II, arguably during World War II. Essentially, it was the bulk of this movement, and it started in which people were seeing the effects that the Nazis' racism towards the Jewish people was actually having on the world, and the amount of destruction that it was wreaking, and this was all because of racism. And African Americans were dealing with a lot of these similar issues in their own home and in America with racism, and there were lynchings and other terrible incidents in which a racist organization such as the Ku Klux Klan was really getting out and going after people due to their race. And these protests were essentially nonviolent. Most of them were nonviolent. The most successful ones were nonviolent, and they were led by Martin Luther King, which is arguably the most significant figure and turning point of African American civil rights. A lot of these movements were sort of nonviolent in like boycotting, for example, the Montgomery bus boycott, which began with Martin Luther King in 1955, after a young African American woman was asked to move from her seat so a white male could sit there. And these were possible due to Jim Crow laws, which stated that a white male would have sort of the privilege on that seat over for African American. And these movements sort of went on to about 1964, and they were backed by Richard Nixon when they began, actually, in 1955, and he stated that he would like Martin Luther King to lead these movements. And in 1964, eventually, they were able to pass the Civil Rights Act. So, yes, essentially, they were very successful with the nonviolent protests. And another thing I would like to talk about is the violent protests. There were violent protests in movements for African American civil rights, but not violent in the sense that they're going out and killing people necessarily, but in that they will protect themselves with violence in order to send the message. And this began with Malcolm X, which he created this Nation of Islam, which stated 4 things that were very significant to the violence. And he did state in that white males were the devil, and that the black man was superior to the white man, and that violence is a necessary step in order to achieve equality. And he actually didn't necessarily want equality. He believed that black males should be superior to white males. And a lot of these protests were sort of violent, and these Islamic ideals sort of created a huge following of violent protesters, which really believed in his statements. And I just figured I should compare these to Martin Luther King's nonviolent protests and how the nonviolent protests were much more successful than the violent approach. The next thing I'm going to talk about is the feminism and women's rights movement. So, feminism began essentially much way before these times, and essentially this movement sort of began after World War II, which during World War II is when a lot of men were shipped off to war, and these women were sort of forced to take on these jobs that these men left behind. And a lot of these jobs women were originally considered not capable of doing, but they proved to be able to do most of them, as a matter of fact, and a lot of them were doing a very efficient job and sort of keeping the economy rolling. And this created controversy when the men came back to the country, and women started losing their jobs because of what men coming back to their jobs, and it caused a lot of controversy. And women began to protest, and you can really refer this back to the women's suffrage movement, in which women were using these nonviolent protests and conventions and sort of getting together and even getting men to sign certain petitions, and which women eventually were able to vote in 1920. And they really referred this to back then, which now that women began working in World War II, and so this sort of ideal that women work, women can vote, and then women can work. So women can do both. Women can do everything that men can do. And it began non-violent protests throughout the country, and sort of very similar to the African American movement. And yeah, this is an illustration of examples of how the women's protest would take place and go on throughout the country. It was very successful, the women's protest, and a lot of these conventions started getting global attention, in which a lot of the United Nations started getting together and saying that women should be equal to men in the workplace, and I do figure that women's was very successful in that, and they did share a very similar goal to that of the African American movement. Now, the last one is going to be the Chicano movement, and in this movement, it was essentially similar to both the women's movement and the African American movement. It was non-violent protests, but these protests were also for similar reasons to that of the African American movement, in which they sought equal education, in which a lot of times that they were discriminated and segregated because they didn't speak English, and they were denied a right to an education because they couldn't speak English. This led to several things, and they were all backed by President John F. Kennedy, which they helped elect into office by majority vote. And John F. Kennedy did return the favor. He began appointing several Latinos to his spots in his administration, and this gave him a lot more influence to make other changes. And one of these big movements was actually the United Farm Workers Association, and this was led by Cesar Chavez. And this goal of this was to unite the farm workers against the horrible, terrible work conditions that they had, and essentially bring them together. And they began doing boycotts similar to that of the African Americans, and they boycotted the grapes at first, and these were essentially successful, and really made the working conditions for the Mexican Americans that were actually, even a lot of Mexican Americans that were born here were not receiving the same positive conditions that an American was receiving, and Cesar Chavez really did help turn that around. I'm going to say that the most successful movement was the women's rights movement, just simply due to the fact that they had so much momentum from the women's suffrage movement, and going into this, they were backed by the United Nations, and they honestly were able to get several conventions and nonviolent protests with little to no opposition, and they were successful in achieving their goals. And actually, all of them were mainly successful in achieving their goals. I just personally do find this one the most successful to our current date. And with that, I will conclude my digital story.